All right, welcome to topic 6.1, the first lesson of our last unit. This unit is on federalism. Today's topic, 6.1, how federalism works and how it's changed over time. By the end of this lesson, you should be able to describe how the relationship between the national and state governments have changed over time. So by now you probably know what federalism is, or hopefully you do from all of our previous lessons, but I want to take a deeper dive into this about what is federalism and why it matters in the first place. You'll hopefully remember that federalism means that power is shared between the national government and the individual state governments. So the federal government was given specific powers. We call those delegated powers. Sometimes we'll call them enumerated powers or express powers, but really those three terms mean pretty much the same things for the intended purposes of this course. Examples of some things that the Constitution says only the federal government can do is manage relationships with other countries. It can also manage the relationships between the individual states themselves. The Constitution explicitly says that only the federal government can print money, so there can't be individual Wisconsin Badger bucks, there can only be a US dollar. On the other hand, most things are reserved to the states. We call these the reserve powers. When the states got together and created the national government, they delegated some powers to the national government, but they reserved or kept some powers to themselves. Actually, they kept most of the power to themselves. So most of what governments actually do is actually done at the state level, not the national level. So for instance, the things you're learning in school, the fact that you have to take this class in order to get a high school diploma, that was decided by the government of the state of Wisconsin, not the federal government. Licensing is also handled by the states themselves. Your driver's license is not a United States driver's license, it's a Wisconsin driver's license. My license to teach this class was issued by the state of Wisconsin, not the federal government. Things that affect your day-to-day life, like garbage collection, that's all left for the states to figure out. The federal government doesn't really have a say in those things. Then there are some things that both the states and the federal government share when it comes to powers. We call these the concurrent powers. Yes, you do have to know the difference between reserved, delegated, and concurrent powers, and examples of each. So examples for something that both the national and state governments can do, they both are allowed to tax you. If you have a job and you look at your paycheck stub, there is a federal income tax and there is a state income tax. Both the national government and the state governments have the authority to build roads. That's why you see city roads, county roads, and interstate highways. They both share some policing powers. There is a local police force, the Cudahy Police. There's a county police force, the sheriffs, the state patrol. But then at the federal level, they also have the FBI, the DEA, the ATF, things like that. And both the national government and the state governments have the authority to borrow money and take out debt in the name of the people of the country. Now, why did we do it this way? Why did the founding fathers decide to divide up power? Remember, one of the things they were afraid of more than anything else was that if you gave someone too much power, then that would create tyranny, right? If too much power was put in the hands of too few hands, it would encourage the abuse of power and endanger those natural rights we've been talking about all year. Our right to our life, our right to our liberty, and the right to our pursuit of happiness. A famous quote from James Madison, one of the founders of our country, says that if men were angels, then no government would be necessary. So if we were all perfect, we wouldn't need a government to rule over us. But if angels were to govern over men, neither external nor internal controls in government would be necessary. That is to say, if we're all human, but angels, perfect beings, ruled over us, then we wouldn't have to worry about the government abusing us. But they said that's also not the case. So in framing or creating a government which is to be administered by men over men, that is, to have human beings running a government to rule over human beings, the difficulty is this. You have to first create the government that can control the governed, that stops us from hurting each other. But you also must create a government that is able to control itself so that it doesn't become the thing that hurts our rights. In short, since men aren't angels, power corrupts, and we need a government, then we need a way to stop corrupt people from wielding too much power. I mean, common sense when you stop and think about it. We also do it this way because, well, frankly, when the Constitution was written, travel was very difficult and took a long time. So, for example, to go from Philadelphia to New York City took over 3 days back in 1789. Today, you can do it in just about 2 hours. So we wanted to keep people we gave our government power to close to us so that we can keep an eye on them. Now, state capitals are closer to us than our national capital, so we're able to keep an eye on the people in our state government, theoretically, much better than we're able to keep an eye on the people in Congress and the federal government. After all, it's only maybe an hour and a half drive to get to Madison, the capital of Wisconsin, from Cudahy, Wisconsin, but it would take probably about 17 hours to drive to the U.S. Capitol building. This is why they gave more power, more responsibility to the state governments, because they were both literally and figuratively closer to the people, trusting them with that power. If a politician abused that power, then it was easier to hold them accountable. But at the same time, the founders realized we still did need a national government to unite the colonies and provide for certain things, like a national defense against the British or the French or whoever else might attack us. Some national government that could settle arguments between the states so that we didn't erupt into civil wars like we saw those wars that broke out all across Europe in the centuries preceding the founding of our country. And we needed a national government to create a national trade system with governments outside of the United States to keep things consistent. That leads to the question, well, who's in charge of what and why? Here we see a shorthand of all the national powers that are provided, that only the national government can do these things, only the state governments can do these things, and both are allowed to share these responsibilities. Now, on your note sheet, you'll have to double-click that image in order to fill in those blanks to have all this information. There are a lot of national powers, there's a lot of current shared powers, and a lot of state reserved powers. This here is only a short sampling of them. Now, if it's not on this list, then you are not going to be responsible for knowing that on the test. So I would recommend pausing the video right now, getting all this information down on your notes, and then restarting the video when you have that down. Again, these are the only powers you're going to be responsible for on the final exam. You will need to know what the national powers are, what the shared powers are, and what the state powers are. Again, this is delegated, reserved, concurrent. Now, things have changed over time, as you may remember from a previous lesson or way back in Unit 1. Federalism hasn't always operated the exact same way. Things have evolved as times have changed and the needs of the country have changed. Originally, these powers were seen as strictly divided between two levels of government. We call this layer cake federalism. Under layer cake federalism, the federal government and the state governments are both supreme in their areas of law. That is, their powers have no overlap, like a layer of a cake. The national government can make these types of laws, the state government can make these types of laws, and there is no intermixing of the two. Each level of government minded their own business, theoretically. Over time, the federal government began to gain more power, creating a new type of federalism where the federal government began to, mix together in with some of the powers of the states, much like vanilla and chocolate mixed together in what we know as marble cake. So we call this marble cake federalism, and this is what made the federal government stronger. True story, this is also why my wedding cake, the bottom part was layer and the top was marble cake, because what's more delicious than two styles of federalism? So you might be wondering, how exactly do we go from layer cake federalism to marble cake federalism? Well, let's give you a quick rundown. The first major event that caused this mixing was called the Civil War. Now, historians accurately study this as a war over slavery. Political scientists study this as a war over federalism. So there are several questions that were being fought over in the Civil War. Let's take a look at it from the perspective of a political scientist. The first question was about this balance of power between the federal and state governments. Could these states nullify, that is, refuse to follow federal laws that they didn't like, even if the federal government was using those delegated powers to make those laws? In the case of the Civil War, the laws that the states didn't want to follow was the federal law that was potentially limiting or ending slavery. Southern states didn't like the fact that the national government could theoretically get rid of slavery, and so they seceded and we fought a huge war over it. In the end, the war answered the question very simply. Nope, states cannot pick and choose which federal laws to follow. They have to follow all federal laws if those laws were created using the delegated powers of Congress. Another question that this war was fought over was, can states leave and form a new national government separate from the United States? That is, how independent can the states be from the national government? Once again, the Civil War answer to this question was nope. Once you're a member state, you have to stay a member state forever. Wisconsin cannot just break away and create a whole new independent country. Once a member of the U.S., always a member of the U.S. And then there's the question that the Civil War was fought about, which is how much power do the states actually have in this federal system? And the war pretty much shifted a lot of power away from the states toward the federal government. Not all of it, but it did drastically change and redefine the relationship between the states. In fact, the federal government passed and then states approved a change to the Constitution known as the 14th Amendment, which said that now the states cannot violate the Bill of Rights, just like the federal government previously could not violate the Bill of Rights. The next big change that happened was during the New Deal. The Great Depression was the worst economic crisis in the nation's history, and there were a lot of serious problems that needed a solution. Massive unemployment with thousands of people out of work, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands. You had groups of people wandering from town to town, city to city, looking for jobs. There was massive poverty on a scale the U.S. just hadn't seen before. So there was a fight, not physical fight, but a legal fight over can the federal government use grants to bribe states to use their reserve powers in ways that will help get us out of the Depression. And the courts resoundingly said, yes, the federal government can offer states financial incentive to use their reserve powers in a way that the federal government would like them to use it. The federal government cannot require them to do those things, but they can offer money and say, if you do this, then we'll give you money. The Great Depression also asked, what are the limits of the Commerce Clause? You remember, the Commerce Clause says that Congress has the delegated power to make rules about things that cross from one state into another state or from another country into the United States. Well, during the Great Depression, the court said that Congress can make laws about any activity that is related to interstate commerce, even if the activity itself is not interstate commerce. So this allowed them to use these powers in a drastically new way. As a result, we saw a massive increase in federal government power. Then came the Civil Rights Movement, which historians accurately study as a fight against racism, but political scientists study this as a fight over natural rights and federalism. Remember, natural rights, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, federalism, division of power between the federal government and the states. So this is how political scientists studied this moment in history. The question that was being fought over is, can the federal government force states to integrate public spaces? That is, force states to get rid of segregation in both areas that are run by the state government, like schools, and areas that are run by local businesses, such as restaurants and movie theaters. So, can the federal government force states to integrate public spaces? Yes, through the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, which says that the states cannot treat people differently. Well, what about those areas that are not run by the government, such as private businesses? Can the federal government force private businesses within a single state to integrate? The answer to that was yes, through the Commerce Clause of the Constitution. A restaurant may only serve people who live in one town and only operate in that single town, not crossing state lines. But the food they serve does cross state lines and thus does affect interstate commerce, and so the federal government has the authority to tell them you cannot segregate that private business. This again was a drastic increase of power of the federal government. It allowed them to make rules about things and laws about things that previously only the states were in charge of. Other ways the federal government has increased its power over areas once solely reserved for the states, well, there's the Necessary and Proper Clause. This stretched the powers of the federal government beyond just what's listed in the Constitution. For more on that, go back to topic 3.1. Then there are what's known as categorical grants. These grants basically are ways where the federal government says, look, we collect a lot of money in taxes, and we would like to share some of that with the states. So categorical grants are money the federal government gives to the states in exchange for the states doing what the federal government wants. It's essentially a bribe for the states to get them to use their reserve powers in a way the federal government would like them to use them. Now, states are free to turn this money down, so it's an incentive or bribe to get them to use their reserve powers. That way, it's not really a violation of federalism because the federal government's saying, look, you don't have to do it this way, but if you do it this way, we're going to throw some money your way so that you can lower your state taxes. A prime example of this is the National Minimum Drinking Age Act of 1984. So the drinking age is actually set by each state, not by the federal government. Prior to 1975, each state had various levels of the drinking age. So the states in blue, like Wisconsin here in 1975, you could drink at the age of 18. States like Alabama, you had to be 19. In states that are orange, like here, Delaware, you had to be 20. The red states, like Utah, you had to be 21. The yellow states had various rules depending on the type of alcohol. This is because federalism allowed each state to make this decision for themselves. But the federal government wanted the drinking age to be 21 across the board. They just did not have the legal authority to set a national drinking age. That is not one of the delegated powers that Congress has. So instead, they said, look, states, if you raise your drinking age to 21, we'd really appreciate that. However, if your drinking age is below 21, then we're going to remove 10% of your federal highway funds each year that you keep that drinking age below the age of 21. In essence, you're free to have a drinking age of 18, 19, 20, or even 10 if you want, but the federal government will then not offer to share any of its federal tax money to help repair your roads. So if you want your roads fixed, you're going to have to raise taxes on your own people in order to pay for those repairs without federal government dollars. No Child Left Behind was another time in which states were bribed, essentially, because states are in charge of federal education policy. The federal government wanted to make sure that schools were doing their best to evaluate the knowledge and understanding of all students, and so they said that they wanted all states to give standardized tests to measure student growth so they could make comparisons from one state to the next. If student scores drop too low or not enough students take the tests, then the schools would lose federal money. And that's why we have all this pretty data about the District of Cudahy, where you can see right here in the 2022-2023 school year, most students, when it came to the English language arts, were actually below basic or basic in our reading levels, with only 24% being proficient and this tiny sliver being advanced. You can see the same thing in mathematics for the same year, with 50% being below basic in math, another 30% being basic, and only 17.3% of us being proficient in mathematics in the District of Cudahy. Diving deeper into the high school, you can even see that you see similar numbers at the high school levels. So this would be stripping out the middle school and the elementary school and just looking at the numbers of, well, yourself, the people taking this test and watching this video. You see here, again, below basic and basic at reading. And look at our math scores right here. That's problematic. So this drastically increased the power of the federal government in education, and a lot of people really didn't like this. In fact, it resulted in teachers doing what was called teaching to the test. So instead of teaching students things that would engage them or interest them, the focus became on making sure kids are ready for these tests so that, we wouldn't lose any federal funding. There became less emphasis on the social sciences and the arts in school. This is from one reason why I think a lot of kids come to high school not knowing their basic continents or oceans, big or even basic moments in history, because, well, they didn't teach social sciences in the lower grades very much because it wasn't on the standardized tests. There was a huge backlash to this in communities who wanted more local control of their schools, and eventually the federal government backed off and repealed parts of No Child Left Behind, but we still do the standardized tests because, well, the states like Wisconsin really like having this data. All right, there you have it. Take a couple minutes here, rewrite today's goal, identify 3 important facts from the notes that help you understand this goal, and at the very bottom there, as always, write at least one question you still have that could help you better understand that learning goal. All right, I'll see you when I see you.